Last night, Ezekiel had explained it when Pastor Phillips asked about his troubled demeanor. "They dream," he said, his voice heavy. "They often dream of the places we're bound to visit. But these dreams were different, darker. Before Phillips could answer, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep but her eyes clear and unsettlingly focused. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice, "in your church, under the third floorboard from the altar, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it. I dreamed about why you hid it." A chill crept down the pastor's spine, one that had nothing to do with the dawn air. No one knew about what he had buried there. 3 months ago, in a moment of weakness, he'd hidden a bottle of whiskey beneath those exact floorboards. He had told himself it was better to keep the temptation close, where he could fight it daily, than to banish it and pretend he was free of its pull. He'd wrapped it in a scrap of cloth, his late son's baby blanket. No one knew, no one but God. "What did you dream, child?" Phillips asked, his voice barely steady. Rachel stepped from the shadows behind her sister, moving with that peculiar, silent grace that always made her seem more spirit than flesh. "The bottle is brown," she whispered. "It's wrapped in a piece of cloth, a baby blanket, blue." Phillips sank into his chair, legs trembling. The cloth was indeed the last remnant of his son, gone 5 years now, a child he could not save. The whiskey was his private penance, a reminder of his failings as a father and a pastor both. Ezekiel watched the pastor with a look that mingled sympathy and a weary understanding. "It began when they were very young," he explained softly. "At first I thought it was childish intuition, how the young sometimes see what we grown folk miss. But as they grew, the things they knew, they became too exact, too impossible to explain away. That Sunday service would linger in Pine Hollow's memory for generations. Ezekiel's sermon itself was not unusual, arousing plea for confession and spiritual renewal. It was what happened afterward that none would ever forget as the congregation drifted toward the doors. Rebecca walked up to Samuel Turner, prosperous farmer known for his generosity and his pride. She looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Mr. Turner," she said sweetly, "the money you've been taking from the church collection, it isn't stealing if you put it back, is it? Papa says God forgives if you're truly sorry." Turner's face drained of color. For 6 months he'd been skimming small sums from the collection plate, just enough to cover debts from a failed business in Louisville. He'd always told himself he would repay it once he got back on his feet, but the secret had festered, like a rot in his soul, before he could answer. Rachel stepped forward and turned her gaze on Martha Whitfield, the old widow who served as the church's self-appointed moral guardian. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "your husband didn't die in the farming accident, did he? He's still alive, somewhere far away. That's why you hide the letters." The widow swayed as if struck. It was true her husband had abandoned her and their children 15 years ago, taking all they had and vanishing into the night. She had told Pine Hollow he had died in a tragic accident to protect her family's dignity. The letters Rachel spoke of pleas for forgiveness from a man living in Missouri were locked in a wooden chest under her bed. She had shown them to no one. One by one, the twins wove through the church, their revelations falling like stones into still water. They told Dr. Hayes of the patients who had died under his careless hands, of knowledge he'd falsely claimed. They told the Millers of the son they kept hidden in the attic, simple-minded, a family shame never spoken aloud. They whispered to young Thomas Brett of his secret trysts with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman whose husband traveled for work. each secret spilled from innocent lips, delivered without anger or scorn like children reciting nursery rhymes, about sins too heavy for grown folk to bear. Pastor Phillips watched, paralyzed, as his quiet congregation turned inward on itself. All his years of preaching, of shepherding his flock undone in moments by two 9-year-old girls who spoke as if God himself whispered in their dreams. And then came Rebecca's final words, words that would haunt Pine Hollow for as long as its name was spoken. She stepped to the altar, her small hand resting on the old wooden cross carved by the town's founders. "This is sacred ground," she said, her voice carrying like a bell. "But it's been stained by what happened. Here before." She turned, fixing Pastor Phillips with eyes that seemed far older than her years. "The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor? They died right here, in this very room. And some of you know exactly why." Silence fell. Like a hammer, even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth itself was waiting for someone to speak. The congregation stared at the pastor, then at Elder Thompson, one of Pine Hollow's last living founders. Slowly, painfully, the old man rose from his pew. Age had bent his body, but his voice still carried the weight of truth. "Child," he rasped, each word deliberate, "you speak of things buried long before you were born. How can you know what you claim to know?" Rebecca turned her solemn gaze on him. "Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder," she said. "Hope Whitman had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried the wooden doll her father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith was in her blue Sunday dress. Hope was in her nightgown. She'd been sick with fever." A hush spread through the sanctuary as the old words came alive again. The older folk, those who had whispered over coffins and shared secrets by firelight, recognized every detail. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, her eyes wide with dread and memory. Outside, the wind finally stirred, whispering through. Pine Hollow's ancient oaks, carrying the weight of truths too long buried beneath the floorboards of a church that was no longer so holy, the night they died. Rachel continued, her voice soft yet unwavering. "It wasn't a house fire that killed them. They came here to this church seeking sanctuary because someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found anyway. The sanctuary was so silent that every breath, every shifting footstep, seemed deafening." Pastor Phillips felt old fragments of overheard conversations stirring in the corners of his memory, whispers that would die when he entered a room. Lingering glances exchanged among the elders when certain names were spoken, the way some families always laid. Flowers on an unmarked patch of ground in the churchyard, Samuel Turner. Still pale from the earlier truth laid bare about his theft, shot up from his pew. "This is madness," he snapped, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. "They're children, spinning tales to frighten us. There's no way they could know any of this." But his denial fell flat. Murmurs rippled through the congregation like wind through dry leaves. Mrs. Carter, Elizabeth's mother-in-law, whispered shakily about the stubborn stains, dark smears that had appeared on the church floor years ago, stains that no amount of scrubbing would lift. Old Benjamin Foster spoke next, voice quavering as he recounted the strange sounds that sometimes echoed through the chapel late at night, soft cries like children weeping, dismissed for decades as wind moaning through the loose boards. Dr. Hayes, though still raw from his earlier shame, spoke in a low, precise voice. "When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we found what looked like bone fragments mixed into the old mortar. He hesitated, then added grimly, "I always wondered if they were human." The weight of his words pressed down on the room like a closing tomb. If the Whitmans had been murdered, her and the remains hidden within the very walls, then every prayer, every hymn sung in this place had risen over unmarked graves. Through it all, Ezekiel Morrison stood, silent, his weathered face lined with worry but not surprise. He had seen this before: his daughters, tearing open the fragile seams of polite secrets with innocent voices that left communities forever changed. Pastor Phillips turned to him, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Morrison, how do they know these things? What manner of gift allows them such sight?" Ezekiel looked over the congregation, then back at his daughters. His voice was low, heavy with years of wondering. "I've asked myself that question every day. Their mother, Sarah, claimed she had the second sight visions, small glimpses of things others couldn't see. But what the girls have, it's more than that. They dream of places they've never been. They speak of people long dead. They carry the weight of secrets meant for the grave." His gaze lingered on the twins, so small at the foot of the altar, suddenly just children again. "At first, I thought it was a blessing, a gift to help the lost find their way back to truth. But I see now it's a burden. They know things no child should know, and they cannot choose to stop." Rebecca raised her head, her face pale and solemn. "We don't choose the dreams," she said. The strength in her voice was gone, replaced by the fragile truth of a child who carried too much. "They come whether we want them or not. We see what was, what is, sometimes what will be." Rachel slipped her hand into her sister's. "The Whitman sisters come to us sometimes, in our sleep. They want people to know what really happened. They want to be remembered properly." The church fell silent again, but now the hush was thick with fear and wonder. Some faces held disbelief, others terrible recognition. And for a few trembling in the pews there flickered a strange, desperate hope that perhaps death did not keep all secrets buried forever. Pastor Phillips felt something shifting inside him, some old certainty cracking like ice underfoot. He could dismiss this as fantasy, protect the illusion of a town built on virtue and faith, or he could follow this terrible truth wherever it led, knowing it might shatter everything Pine Hollow thought it knew of itself. That night, as dusk smothered the valley and Pine Hollow's oil lamps flickered to life, Pastor Phillips sat alone in his study, his open Bible forgotten beside him. The Morrison twins had forced him to see the questions he'd tried for years to ignore when he'd first come to Pine Hollow. Eager to shepherd a quiet flock and leave behind the dogma and politics of Kentucky's larger parishes, he'd noticed the gaps in Pastor Hayes's old records, small omissions in an otherwise meticulous ledger. The winter of 1818 was curiously thin on detail. Entries about bitter snow, hunger, deaths among the elderly, but the Whitmans, Jacob, Mary, and their two bright daughters were reduced to a single line about a tragic house fire. Why had Hayes, so exact in recording births and deaths, brushed past such a calamity with only a footnote? Long after the church lamps had gone out, Phillips rummaged through the musty archive behind the pulpit boxes of yellowed papers no one had touched in years. And there, tucked beneath brittle rosters and marriage bands, he found it, a slim, leather journal, the corners soft with age, the ink inside faded but legible. Pastor Hayes's handwriting by flickering candlelight, Phillips read words that chilled him to his bones. Hayes had been tormented by what he'd witnessed that December. Jacob Whitman, the entries said, had uncovered something, some festering. deceit among Pine Hollow's founders, theft, corruption, perhaps worse. He had demanded confession, restitution, truth. On December 20th, 1818, Jacob had confronted them in this very church. Accusations flew, voices rose, threats were made, and when the night ended, the Whitman family fled for sanctuary only to be found by the same men whose secrets they threatened to reveal. Hayes's final entry, dated December 22nd, was little more than a dying prayer. The Lord forgive us for what was done. Jacob and his family came here for shelter, but they were hunted even here. I heard the children crying, then only silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Pastor Phillips sat back, the candle sputtering low, the ancient journal trembling in his hands. Outside, Pine Hollow slept dreaming its righteous dreams under a sky thick with unshed storms. Inside, the pastor knew the dead were restless, and the truth was awake at last. Elder Thompson and the others insisted we must protect the community's future, that the truth would destroy us all. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Pastor Phillips set the fragile journal down, his hands trembling as the final words bled into the flickering lamplight. The implications clawed at his mind. The Whitman family hadn't died in a house fire at all. They had been hunted down and silenced in the very sanctuary meant to shield them. Pine Hollow's founding fathers had murdered a family to protect a lie, burying their guilt beneath consecrated floorboards. But how could the Morrison twins know such things? Details no living soul had ever spoken aloud what Faith wore when she died, the scrap of cloth around the whiskey bottle, the hidden stone in the church's foundation. Before Phillips could gather his thoughts, a soft knock sounded at his door. Standing in the moonlight was Rebecca, her small frame framed by the night, hair neatly braided, as if ready for a solemn task. She regarded him with those unsettling eyes that held the hush of graveyards and secrets unsaid. "Pastor Phillips," she said in that clear, childlike voice. "You found Pastor Hayes's journal, didn't you? The one hidden behind the loose stone in the foundation." Phillips felt the floor drop away beneath him. How did you know where it was?" he asked hoarsely. "Faith showed me," Rebecca said, matter of fact, in a dream. She said Pastor Hayes was a good man who was forced to do bad things. She wanted someone to know the truth. The way she spoke, so casual, as if communing with the dead were as ordinary as reciting scripture made the hair on Phillips's arms rise. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "what do you actually see when you dream?" Her small face grew grave, shadows shifting in her eyes. "Everything," she whispered. "Not just what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Whitmans didn't mean for blood to be spilled. They only wanted Jacob quiet." Phillips leaned closer, dread knotting his gut. What had Jacob found? Rebecca glanced past him to where Rachel sat by the cabin window, staring out at the moonlit churchyard. "The money that built the church didn't all come from donations," she said. "Some of it was stolen from travelers who never left these mountains. Jacob found out when he made horseshoes for horses that belonged to dead men. Pieces began to fall into place, dark puzzle fragments clicking together in mind. He recalled old stories of travelers who vanished along Pine Hollow's trails, their disappearances blamed on wolves, storms, or wild mountain passes. But what if they hadn't vanished at all? What if they had been removed? Rebecca's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. "The church was built with blood money. That's why faith and hope can't rest. Their blood was spilled on ground already cursed. Phillips felt the foundation of his faith quake beneath him. The church where he had sought shelter for his own sins, where he had preached salvation and penance, had been bought with murder and consecrated with yet more innocent blood. And yet some rational corner of his mind still whispered, "How can you be sure?" The answer came sooner than he expected. At dawn, as the Morrisons readied their wagon to continue their circuit 3 days, stretched to 6. By the twins' revelations, a lone horseman appeared on the eastern trail. He was a man in his 50s, well-dressed, bearing the careful polish of the city, with a posture that spoke of education and authority. He introduced himself over Pastor Phillips's humble hearth as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington. "I represent the estate of Marcus Webb," Brennan explained as he sipped the offered coffee. "Mr. Webb died recently in Louisville. Among his effects we discovered records suggesting he had business dealings here in Pine Hollow during its earliest years. I'm attempting to trace certain funds that may have been misappropriated." The name turned Phillips's blood to ice. Marcus Webb. It was there, in Hayes's journal, one of the travelers who had vanished along Pine Hollow's trails in 1818, carrying a fortune in land money meant for Tennessee. Before Phillips could form an answer, Rebecca appeared at his elbow, silent as dawn mist. She looked up at Brennan with that terrible innocence. "Mr. Webb had a gold watch," she said. "His initials were inside the cover. The crystal was cracked because he dropped it when he fell from his horse." Brennan's cup froze halfway to his lips. His eyes flicked to Phillips, then back to the child. How could you know about that watch? That detail was in private. Letters Marcus sent only to his brother. Rachel appeared beside her sister like a phantom stepping from a dream. "The watch is buried behind the church," she said softly, "with his money bag and his horse's bridle. Elder Thompson hid them there after what happened on the trail." The silence that followed struck Phillips like a hammer blow. The twins' knowledge, if proven true, could only come from one place, and it was not of this world. Brennan's eyes narrowed with grim resolve. "Then we dig," he said sharply. "If the watch is there, we have evidence of murder and theft. I will not leave without it." Elder Thompson, standing nearby with the weariness of 73 hard years etched into his face, stepped forward. His shoulders sagged under the weight of ghosts too long carried. "You speak of things you don't understand, stranger," he rasped, voice rough as gravel. "This community was built by people who did what they had to do to survive the wilderness. Survival does not justify murder," Brennan snapped. "If these accusations hold, Pine Hollow was founded on blood and stolen silver." Rebecca turned her unblinking gaze on Thompson. "The nightmares stopped after the first year, didn't they?" she asked gently. "You told yourself that meant God forgave you." The old man's resolve shattered. He swayed, pale as snow. "Child, you couldn't know about that." Rachel's small voice cut the morning air like a blade. "About how Marcus Webb appears to you in your dreams, begging you to let him go. About how you see his face every night before sleep." Elder Thompson sank onto a stump, covering his eyes with shaking hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. "We only meant to take the money. We were starving, our children were sick. Winter was coming, but Webb fought back." And then his voice broke, the confession dissolving into the hush like ash on the wind. Pastor Phillips felt the last illusions of Pine Hollow crumble. The church he had devoted himself to, the flock he had tended so carefully, all built on a graveyard of secrets. Beside him, Ezekiel Morrison rested a hand on the pastor's shoulder, his rough voice calm amid the ruin. Truth has its own hunger. Pastor, my daughters don't choose what they reveal. They're simply the door that truth walks through. Brennan's eyes blazed with righteous determination. We dig today. Outside, the townsfolk gathered as spades struck the cold earth behind the church, digging down through layers of soil and lies alike, as if the dead themselves demanded to be heard. At last, within hours, 6 men were digging behind the church, their shovels striking cold earth under the Morrison twins' precise, unnerving directions. Pastor Phillips stood nearby, dread tightening round his heart like a vice. Every spadeful of dirt pulled Pine Hollow closer to a reckoning that would tear apart its carefully tended myth of godliness and sacrifice. They didn't have to dig deep. Barely 3 feet down, a dull metallic clink echoed through the hush. Kneeling, Brennan brushed away the last layer of soil with a lawyer's care. There, half buried in the frozen ground, was a tarnished gold pocket watch. A crack split its crystal exactly as Rebecca had described. Inside, the engraved initials M.W. gleamed faintly in the dying light. Beside it lay a rotted leather bag, its coins long since claimed by moisture and time, but its shape and stitching still clear enough to betray what it had once carried. Near that, they found a horse's bridle, decayed but unmistakable. Brennan turned each piece over with the grim efficiency of a man who built careers on undeniable proof. "This watch matches Marcus Webb's description perfectly," he said, his voice cutting through the whispering crowd. The crack, the monogram, even the broken chain, exactly as his brother recorded. But it was Elder Thompson's reaction that told everyone more than any relic ever could. The old man stared at the unearthed items like a man seeing the dead rise. His lips moved in a whisper of half prayer, half confession. When he finally spoke, his voice was a brittle rasp. "There were others," he breathed. "Webb wasn't the first. And God forgive me, he wasn't the last. The trail through these hills was perfect, lonely, dangerous, easy to blame wolves or storms. Travelers came through with pockets full of land, money, and never left." A stunned silence fell as the scope of Pine Hollow's sins settled over. Its people like a burial shroud. This settlement, its church, its homes, its steeple pointing at heaven had been paid for in blood. Yet even as proof of the crimes piled up, Phillips found himself haunted by a deeper question. How? How could the Morrison twins know the precise hiding place of relics buried before they were born? How could they describe victims they'd never met, details hidden for 16 years, whispered only to the dead? That answer, when it came, would be worse than any rational explanation he could have prayed for. By dawn the next day, word had spread like wildfire down the mountain trails. A delegation arrived from the county seat, the sheriff, a silver-haired judge named Harrison, and 2 federal marshals whose files had long been thick with the names of travelers who vanished between Lexington and Knoxville. In a grim irony, the church built on blood was now a courtroom for its own unmasking. Pastor Phillips sat stiff-backed in the front pew, hands folded so tightly they ached. Elder Thompson, gaunt and shaking under the weight of decades, sat flanked by 2 other surviving members of Pine Hollow's founding Circle Grey Ghosts, brought blinking into daylight, but all eyes fell most heavily on Rebecca and Rachel. Morrison, 2 small girls standing at the pulpit where grown men had once thundered about sin and salvation. Judge Harrison, who had begun the morning a skeptic, now studied them with an expression that mixed dread with disbelief. "Rebecca Morrison," he called, voice echoing in the rafters. "Tell this court how you knew where to find Marcus Webb's watch." Rebecca stood so small and pale beneath the judge's towering bench, but her voice, when it came, carried clear and simple. "Faith Whitman told me. In my dream," she said, "the same men who killed her family killed the travelers too. She wanted everyone to know." Harrison's gaze shifted to Rachel. "And you? How do you know these things? These murders happened long before you were born." Rachel's hands twitched at her sides. Her voice was barely more than a breath, but the church heard every word. "The dreams show us what happened. We see the people. We hear their last words. We feel their fear." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The sheriff, a practical man who trusted evidence over ghost stories, spoke up gruffly. "Girls, how many died on those trails?" Rebecca's eyes flicked to her sister before she answered. 11 men, over 3 years. They came alone, with money for land or churches or trading posts. One was a preacher like Papa. He had gold coins hidden in his saddle. A hush fell, as Rachel continued without missing a beat. His name was Samuel Collins. He was riding to Tennessee to start a new church. His horse was a bay mare with a white star on her forehead. Sheriff Mackenzie flipped through a battered old notebook, his gloved finger trembling as it landed on a scribbled line. He looked up, pale. "Samuel Collins disappeared along this trail in September 1819, he said hoarsely. "His horse matches the description exactly, but the final blow came not from the twins, but from Elder Thompson himself." He pushed himself upright, bony hands gripping the pew as if the wood might steady the storm inside him. "Your Honor," he rasped, voice cracking like rotted timber, "I can bear this no more. These children speak truth, every word of it, but there is more, worse than the murders, worse than the stolen gold." The wind moaned through the loose boards overhead, as if the church itself strained to hear what came next. "The Whitmans didn't just find out by accident," Thompson continued, tears coursing through the lines on his weathered face. "Jacob was my brother-in-law, I told him. I thought bloodkin would stay quiet, but Jacob had a conscience stronger than family. He said he'd ride to Lexington, expose us, make us pay restitution to the families. So we followed him. We waited." He sagged, shoulders heaving. "He brought Mary and the twins here, thinking God's house would protect them. But we were desperate men with everything to lose." Rebecca's voice cut through his grief like a blade. "Tell them about the babies," she said softly. The old man broke crumbling in front of everyone. "Dear God," he whispered, "how could you know? Mary Whitman was 8 months pregnant. Twins. They might have lived if we'd gone. For help if we'd spared her." Rachel stepped forward beside her sister. Her voice was softer than the wind, but struck every heart like a funeral bell. "That's why we see so much. Faith and Hope Whitman weren't the only children who died that night. Their unborn sisters died too. 4 souls crying out for someone to remember them. For a heartbeat, no one in Pine Hollow breathed. The old church, drenched in secrets, seemed to tremble on its foundation built on blood, now forced to stand. Witness to the truth it could no longer bury. And through it all, 2 small girls, no longer children. Not quite prophets held the gaze of a community that could never again pretend it didn't hear the dead. The weight of Rachel's final revelation settled over the church like a suffocating blanket. If the Morrison twins were truly channeling the spirits of the dead Whitman children, including the unborn twins, it challenged every comforting certainty Pine Hollow's people had clung to about the nature of the soul, the afterlife, and God's justice. Dr. Hayes, the settlement's weary physician, found his voice at last. I helped bury the Whitmans, he said hoarsely. I saw the evidence of Mary's pregnancy. We told ourselves the babies were too young to matter, too young to need burial rites. Ezekiel Morrison laid a comforting hand on his daughter's shoulders. Every soul matters to God, he said firmly, his eyes sweeping the stunned faces. Around him, no life is too small to carry eternal weight. But Judge Harrison was less interested in theological debate than in earthly justice. He turned back to the crumbling figure of Elder Thompson. Mr. Thompson, are you now confessing to the murders of Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, their daughters Faith and Hope, and their unborn twins? Thompson's voice came out hollow, like wind through an empty crypt. I am, and to the murders of 11 travelers who trusted us with their lives. We did it together, myself, Samuel Bradford, Marcus Perry. We planned it, carried it out, and buried it for 16 years. The 2 other old men named sat frozen, masks of resignation and terror carved into weathered flesh. Sheriff Mackenzie rose to place them in chains, but Judge Harrison lifted a hand before we proceed with charges. He said, eyes narrowing, I want to understand how these children know what they know. Details never written down. Secrets no living soul should hold. Rebecca lifted her clear blue eyes to meet his. Your Honor, she said softly but firmly, some truths are too heavy to stay buried forever. Faith Whitman and her sisters waited 16 years for someone to hear their story. And how do you hear them? Harrison pressed, leaning forward, his stern face tight with the strain of disbelief. Rachel stepped to her sister's side. We don't know exactly, she admitted. Since we were very small, we've dreamed of places we've never seen, people we never met. Papa says our mama had second sight, but ours is different. Different how? The judge asked sharply. The girls exchanged a long look before Rebecca answered. Mama could sense secrets in the living, their fears, their hidden sins. But we see the echoes tragedy leaves behind, especially when innocent blood is spilled. Ezekiel Morrison's voice cracked as he stepped forward. I've spent years trying to understand my daughter's gift. Ministers, doctors, scholars. No one can explain it, but all have seen it for themselves. And not once has it failed to be true. Judge Harrison fell silent, studying the girls as if they were puzzle pieces that refused to fit any known pattern. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. If you can see what others cannot, tell this court where the other victims lie. The question hung in the stale air like incense smoke. If the twins could locate the missing bodies, it would erase any last shred of doubt, close the circle of Pine Hollow's sins for good. Rebecca closed her eyes, her small brow furrowed as if listening to distant voices. When she spoke, her words were soft but clear. Some are in the old mine shaft east of town, she said. Others were thrown into Devil's Creek, where the water runs deep and dark. 3 are buried under the church floor, their bones mixed in with the stones. A collective gasp rippled through the church. Pastor Phillips staggered under the weight of what she had revealed. He had offered prayers, broken bread, and baptized children above unmarked graves. Sheriff Mackenzie turned to the judge, jaw tight. Your Honor, if we're to prove this, we'll need to tear up the floor. And so you shall, Harrison said grimly. But first, Elder Thompson, where did the stolen money go? Thompson lifted a shaking hand, gesturing around them. Here, into the church, the school, the mill. We told ourselves good works would redeem us. We told ourselves God would forgive us if we built something righteous from evil. The judge's gaze hardened, and the victims' families, Did any of you ever think of them? The wives, the children left behind. It was Rachel who answered, her voice as gentle as a graveyard breeze. Marcus Webb had a wife named Elizabeth and 2 sons. Samuel Collins was engaged his fiancée, waited until she died of consumption 3 years later. They all waited, wondered, grieved. The room fell so still that the old timbers seemed to creak louder than the people's breathing. These weren't just names, they were human beings, waiting for someone to speak the truth they could not. This court will reassess while we investigate every claim, Judge Harrison declared at last. Sheriff Mackenzie, begin the excavations. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, Marcus Perry Yu will remain in custody. As the 3 broken men were led away in chains, Pine Hollow's congregation drifted out in a daze. 16 years of lies had collapsed in a single morning. But for Pastor Phillips, the deepest questions twisted like thorns in his mind. How did 2 9-year-olds hold the secrets of the dead? What did it say about the soul, about sin and absolution, about a God who lets the dead whisper to the living? The Morrison twins stood near the altar, 2 small figures dwarfed by the enormity of what they had revealed. They looked exhausted, as though they carried not only their own childhoods, but the weight of every silenced voice they had ever heard. "Papa," Rebecca whispered, tugging at her father's sleeve. "Can we go now? The voices are loud today. They're getting hard. To keep straight, Ezekiel gathered his daughters close, brushing a hand over their tangled hair. Soon, he promised softly, but first we help these people understand what you've shown them. As the sun reached its zenith over Pine Hollow, casting harsh light over graves, both marked and hidden this place of prayers and secrets, prepared to face the consequences of sins carved into its very bones. When the excavation began, what they found proved every word the twins had spoken. Beneath the sanctuary, under cracked planks and centuries of dust, lay 3 skeletons tangled in foundation stone. Beside them, a gold ring inscribed J. Joshua Patterson, the vanished surveyor. A silver-handled knife once belonging to William Morse, the missing merchant. And around the 3rd skeleton's neck, a battered copper cross, exactly as Robert Chun's widow had described. Judge Harrison's hair seemed grayer when he stood before the townsfolk again on the 4th day. "The evidence is clear," he declared, his voice ringing off the walls that had once hidden so much. 11 men murdered, 1 family slaughtered to protect the secret, a church, a town, an entire legacy built on blood. Elder Thompson and the others stood shackled before him, too old to see freedom again, but now forced to carry the truth they could no longer bury. Pastor Phillips listened, numb, feeling the weight of every sermon he'd preached over those hidden bones. But it was Rebecca who spoke, last, her small voice, steady, impossibly old. "Judge Harrison, may we speak about forgiveness?" The judge looked at the child who had done what no adult ever could unearth the dead, and in his tired eyes something like respect flickered. "Yes, Miss Morrison," he said softly, "I think we'd all better listen." He had learned to listen carefully to anything Rebecca Morrison said. "Of course, child," Judge Harrison replied gently. "What would you like to say?" Rebecca and Rachel stepped forward, standing together beneath the wooden cross that had presided silently over 16 years of deception. Rebecca spoke first. "The Whitman sisters want everyone to know they forgive the men who killed them." Rachel finished the thought as she so often did. "They understand that fear makes people do terrible things. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The men who committed these crimes must face justice, And this community must make things right for the families left behind. Judge Harrison inclined his head solemnly. The court agrees. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will stand trial for murder and robbery. But what of Pine Hollow itself? What becomes of a church and town built with blood money? It was Ezekiel Morrison who answered, his voice weathered by sorrow and hope alike. Scripture tells us the sins of the fathers need not be visited on the children if they choose righteousness over silence. This community can be redeemed, but only through confession, restitution, and true repentance. Pastor Phillips, who had remained silent for days, finally found his voice. Then the church must be consecrated anew. The remains beneath the floor will be removed and buried with dignity. We'll do everything possible to identify and compensate the victims' families. We'll build a memorial so no one forgets. How this place was built, Solicitor Brennan, pen scratching furiously across his ledger, looked up. The Marcus Webb estate alone is owed significant restitution. His brother has authorized me to seek full recovery, plus damages for 16 years of anguish. In his shackles, Elder Thompson spoke for the first time since confessing. The money is gone, he said, voice dull with defeat, spent on buildings, farms, families, church upkeep. There's nothing left. Asterisk Judge Harrison's face hardened. Then the community itself bears the debt. The buildings constructed with stolen wealth will be sold. Proceeds will go to the families of the dead. Pine Hollow, as it exists, will cease to be. A stunned hush swept through the church. Families who had built lives here would lose their homes. Elderly neighbors would be uprooted. Children would be scattered to distant settlements. Everything. They had known Gumby because of the secrets buried beneath their feet. Then Rebecca spoke again, her clear voice silencing the wind rattling the old boards. Your Honor, there's something else you need to know. Pine Hollow's crimes didn't stop in 1820. The church seemed to exhale, the walls creaking in protest. Judge Harrison narrowed his eyes. What do you mean, child? Rachel stepped closer to her sister's side. The old mine shaft where some of the bodies were thrown, it's not just a grave for old crimes. People are still disappearing in these mountains. Not the same men, but others who learned the ways where to strike, how to hide what they've done. Secrets don't stay buried. Sometimes they breed. Sheriff Mackenzie straightened sharply. You're saying these murders have continued? Rebecca nodded. Knowledge like that doesn't die with the men who first used it. Others learned. Others killed. The implications rippled through the congregation like a physical blow. What had begun as a single dark secret had grown roots and branches, feeding a legacy of violence that stretched far beyond. Pine Hollow's neat cabins and whitewashed church. Judge Harrison rose, his face pale but resolute. Sheriff Mackenzie the investigation, every trail, every old rumor. We end this here and now. As deputies spread out to coordinate the search, the Morrison twins stood hand in hand, two small figures bearing the heavy burden of voices that would not stay silent. They had served as vessels for the dead, conduits for truths long denied. Their father knelt beside them, eyes soft with pride and grief. Are you ready to leave this place? He asked quietly. Rebecca glanced around the church one last time. Rough-hewn walls, the cracked windows, the hollow echo of prayers whispered over hidden bones. The voices are quieter now, she said. Faith and hope can rest. Rachel squeezed her sister's hand. But there will be other places, other voices. She looked up at her father, her eyes too old for her years. "Papa, why do we have to carry all this sadness?" Ezekiel's voice caught in his throat. "I don't know, little ones, but I believe God gives the heaviest burdens to those strong enough to carry them. Maybe your gift serves a purpose bigger than any of us can see." Asterisk, as the Morrison family gathered their few belongings and stepped out into the grey dawn, Pastor Phillips watched them go. He felt the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. Should he flee this place, this church built on stolen lives, or stand amid its ashes and help plant seeds for something new? He found his answer in the quiet courage of the girls who had torn away Pine Hollow's lies with nothing but truth and innocence. If two children could bear such terrible knowledge with grace, perhaps there was hope even here. 3 weeks later, Pine Hollow was gone. The church dismantled, its timbers sold off to help repay debts to families who had waited decades for closure. Houses abandoned, fields left to weeds, residents scattered across Kentucky and Tennessee, carrying with them the knowledge that their homes had been paid for in blood. But in dusty church halls and cabin hearths across the frontier, a new story spread of 2 young sisters with eyes too old for their faces, who spoke the secrets of the dead and tore apart sins that grown men had hidden for a generation. Some dismissed it as frontier superstition. Others whispered it was proof that God's justice walks beside us in ways we do not understand. The Morrison family moved on, drifting from church to church across Appalachia. In their wake, communities were shaken awake. Old crimes unearthed, hidden truths dragged into the light. Rachel and Rebecca Morrison-Tini, prophets, carrying burdens too big for their shoulders. Judge Harrison's final report ran 40 pages long. Future legal scholars would quote his final words for generations. This case challenges our deepest beliefs about justice, truth, and the reach of conscience beyond the grave. Science may never explain the Morrison children's knowledge, but the accuracy of their testimony cannot be denied. Some truths refuse to stay buried forever. Pastor Phillips eventually built a new ministry in eastern Tennessee, where he spent the rest of his life helping people face the shadows in their own backyards. He never forgot the Morrison twins nor the 3 days when 2 9-year-old girls taught a whole community what it truly meant to listen to the dead. The mystery of the twins was never solved. Medical men could not explain them. Theologians could not agree whether they were saints or something stranger. But the record stands. Every word they spoke about Pine Hollow's buried sins proved true. Perhaps the most unsettling part is not what they revealed about the past, but what they hinted about the future. If the dead cannot rest while murderers walk free, if innocence can bridge the chasm between life and death, then maybe justice is larger than any courtroom. Maybe it echoes forever. The Morrison twins vanished from the records. Sometime in the 1840s, some say they lived out there, days traveling the remote corners of Appalachia, uprooting secrets wherever they found them. Others believe they buried their gift and tried to live quiet, ordinary lives, but in the hollows and ridges where secrets linger, travelers still whisper about 2 strange sisters who appear when darkness grows to thick, who know things they shouldn't, who speak for those who can't, who remind the guilty that truth never dies. Some mysteries are bigger than any story we can write down. Some truths are too stubborn to stay buried, and sometimes, just sometimes, the smallest voices carry the weight of the dead. Do you believe the Morrison twins truly spoke for the murdered? Or was there some hidden explanation we may never find? Share your theory in the comments. And if you want more true tales that defy what we think we know, subscribe, hit that bell, and remember, some secrets refuse to rest, and some children were born to speak them out loud.